Hi, my name is Dan Gomez, and this is Mental Health Super Omnia. That is mental health above all. We are all about identifying and understanding mental health issues and finding a path to help. Today, we want to talk about mother-daughter relationships, particularly as it relates to someone who might have a mental illness. We have two guests with us today. First is Deborah Kossman. Deb won the Trio House Press's Nonfiction Award for Lost, Found, Kept, a memoir, which was published in January of 2025. Book Pages named it one of the best memoirs of the year. And just on a personal basis, let me tell you, I agree with them. Her essays feature articles and poetry have appeared in the New York Times, the Nashville Review, Memoir Monday, Psychotherapy Networker, and Psyche, just to name a few. Deb is a clinical psychologist who lives in Havertown, Pennsylvania. And for more information on her, go to lostfoundkept.com. We also have Erica Burgoon. Erica is a member of the leadership team at Equilibria and is a licensed clinical psychologist with 25 years experience. She provides clinical services across the lifespan and specializes in working with depression, anxiety, and trauma. She also has personal experience caring for one parent who experienced a traumatic brain injury and another parent with several physical and mental health complications. And Erica, I don't think I've ever told you, but I actually had a nephew who had traumatic brain injury. And there's a whole range that you can have in that particular area, but it can be extraordinarily devastating. Yes. At any rate, Deb, we did read your book, Lost, Found, Kept. It is a very engaging story about your intelligent, sensitive, and book-loving mother who created the worst hoarder house ever seen. And it's also about your relationship with her and your family. Now, you speak lovingly about your mother's strengths and her being a complex human being, but her behavior ultimately caused somewhat of a rift between you two. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I think anybody who's dealt with a parent with mental illness knows how difficult it is at times to manage your own feelings and to manage your parent. So I think in this particular instance, my mom, developed as we were leaving home a pretty severe hoarding disorder that gradually progressed over the years. And we actually, my sister and I, were not able to go into the house for 30, almost 30 years. And so when we were finally in a crisis situation with my mom and we got in there, it was pretty difficult to deal with. She had level 5 hoarding, which we fondly call at my house DEFCON 5 hoarding, which is the most extreme where there's real health and safety issues. And, it was a bad scene. So the rift, I think it's complicated, right? Because I think there was a rift in terms of a clean out and what to do in this situation. I think it's sort of normal aging adult stuff. That you have to deal with parents who are at that time in your life. My mom, when we went into the house, was 82 years old. But also it was complicated because of her mental illness and the extent of the hoarding.
So Deb, you and I are both psychologists, and as Dan mentioned, my experiences are not identical to yours, but I have many of these experiences of caring for parents who are compromised for various mental and physical reasons. And I'm curious what it was like for you. I find myself sometimes when I'm thinking about or trying to understand what I'm going through with my parents, I can step back and I can put my psychologist hat on and I understand this in one way, right? But that doesn't change the fact that I'm the daughter, I'm in the thick of it. And sometimes all that great knowledge can feel like it goes out the window when things are in a crisis mode or really emotional. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit. Do you think you experience this differently because you were also a psychologist? Do you think it maybe wouldn't have mattered at all, psychologists or not, because of the severity of what your mother was experiencing and you by extension?
Yeah. Well, I think, look, we had this idea that somehow psychologists, mental health professionals are better equipped to deal with terrible things that happen than your average person. But, at the end of the day, as you said, we're still people and we still struggle with the same stuff. And I think one of the things I really wanted to do in the book was to talk about the amount of shame and difficulty that was in this situation and how hard it was to deal with even as a psychologist. Because I don't think, while managing my mother through the years, I had certainly honed my psychology skills, doing that in terms of our relationship. You know, in the end, I was an angry, overwhelmed, sad and grief-stricken and traumatized person dealing with the situation that she'd created. And I think I really wanted to talk about that in the book as a real person. I think after everything was over, trying to make sense of it, I did a lot more reading about hoarding. I knew some stuff about it, but I think it's massively under discussed in our field. If you look at the statistics about it, 1 in 40 Americans had the diagnosis, which only officially became a diagnosis in 2013. That's a lot of people and a lot of family members and people in the community, even that are affected by the consequences of hoarding. So there's a lot of us out there.
You speak to such a range of emotions in the book, sometimes on the same page. I was struck by one page where with this like loving compassion, you were reflecting on like, does she think she deserves to live with this? And then a few sentences later, you're talking about hot rage and I think murderous rage, and just really speaks to like the range of emotions that we can feel in these situations, sometimes like second to second. But the many emotions that you really, the book evokes, helplessness kept coming through to me. And it certainly resonates with me personally. I'm struck by sometimes I think when people on the outside look in at what they think adult children of parents who are struggling should be able to do, it's the proverbial, like, well, I would just take the car keys. Like, sure. Okay.
Right.
That's like when you're in that spot. So, I was wondering if you could say more about that, about that feeling of helplessness that really comes out when we're in these situations, and maybe what you may have learned about how to manage that.
Yeah. Well, I think, look, anytime you have a parent with, a brain injury, a chronic mental illness, my mom all her life was very high functioning, but struggled with issues, which I talk about in the book, because, in the book, I try and make sense of sort of how we got here. And I think that sense of powerlessness, one of the things we talk about, for example, when people go to Al-Anon, right, is that loving detachment and sort of the ability to kind of be able to understand that you don't have control over another person's behavior. You only have control over your own behavior and your own reactions. That said, right, when you have to deal with someone, and care for them in some way and be in their life, that sense of helplessness and powerlessness is sometimes, being angry actually is a form of activation, right? I could be depressed and sad and feel powerless, or I could be enraged and use that rage to clean up, 30 years of garbage. And I think we don't talk often enough in caregiving. We talk about, so the sweetness of caregiving and what you can get from it, but we don't talk as much about the toll that it takes on people, and that sometimes anger and irritation and all those feelings that don't get acknowledged, are helpful in some ways because they keep you activated enough to be able to do what you have to do. And I think a lot of people are left feeling alone and shamed about having those feelings. I mean, I was pretty murderous feeling about my mom, as you read in the book. I mean, I tell you there had been no running water in that house for between 2 and 6 years, so there was no sanitation. We cleaned garbage. You know, there were things that were meaningful in that house, and my mom was kind of oblivious in a way, or chose to be oblivious about the process that we were going through. And it was pretty infuriating. And one of the things I really worked hard in the book was to really kind of balance that anger with the other thing that was there, was that we wouldn't have done any of this if we hadn't loved her and wanted to be, to help her through it. And we had been trying for years to address it and couldn't really address it because in mental illness, people's autonomy trumps doing good. I teach ethics, and, autonomy trumps beneficence. You try and respect somebody's autonomy until they're in trouble, right? And so your example about taking the car keys is an example of that, right? Like you only take the car keys when you know that that person has no more judgment about it. They can't do it.
You know, I picked up on the helplessness, of course, but for me, it kind of goes even farther back. When I read the book, some of my favorite quotes: "I continued to do nothing. What was there to do? Was this about living the way she wanted, or was it about an illness?" But you also say, if I'm not going to do anything to upset or question my mother's reality, that's actually your mother talking about her mother, but it comes through as your voice as well, at least as I read the book. You also say, I don't want to disappoint her. Part of me doesn't want to be closer to her world. I just want to continue living in my own. So for me, there's almost a wall. Like there's normal separation between parent and child, but in this particular case, there's a little bit more of a wall that's built. Am I correct in perceiving that, or is that incorrect?
I think I think that's perceptive in some ways. I think one of the things about separating from my mom, because I was the kid that was parentalized, and, we don't talk about this with parentalized children, is that, you get some goodies for being parentalized because you get to do a lot and you learn a lot, but also you're not an adult, so you're always inadequate, right? So that feeling of not being able to fully, accomplish things or fully feel good about what you're able to do when you grow up as a parentalized child is hard. Like you have to work through that before you feel legitimately confident in yourself. And I think that we don't talk about that with the parentalized children, so much, like sort of, what's good about that, what's not so good about that. I think my mom's hoarding started around the time my sister and I really began separating as adolescents, and I went off to college. That was sort of the beginning pieces of the hoarding behavior. And I think it was grief on her part. She was very connected to me and to my sister. And I think it was a very difficult process for her to let go in that way. And I had to work very hard to sort of set the boundary, which I talk about in the book about, and I hate that phrase, setting the boundary, but like being able to be independent and have her respect that independence. And I think that was the struggle. And so probably in some ways I was harsher with her around some of that because I had to push harder to get away than my sister did because I had that role of the parentalized child who took care of her a lot, so emotionally. So I think that was a piece of it. Um, and I think, well, we can talk more about it. I'll let you guys ask more questions.
Well, I just wanted to comment too. You mentioned the love you had for your mom and the love that she had for you and your sister. And it was even evident, the scenes of you cleaning out the house and some of the things you're coming across, lost gifts, mementos, pictures, even in that mess, that there was some evidence of that. Yeah. And you were just speaking about your sister and the relationship there. And that certainly stuck with me in the book as I was reading the book too, that often these roles that we find ourselves in as various siblings in a household, they're not over when childhood is over, and they last well into adulthood. And you shared some interesting reflections both about your direct interactions with your sister and some of the ways that you even kind of managed what information she was receiving and how much you were pulling her into this process. That parentification, that protection, you can still see evidence of that well into adulthood. And I was wondering if you could speak about that a little bit, about that relationship. Certainly, I think when we are caring for aging parents, our siblings are our natural allies, but it's so rare in a family that is shared equally among the siblings. And I think we could see that in your writing.
Yeah, I think it's never shared equally. I think that's an illusion that every sibling sort of kicks in what they can kick in. The bigger piece is being able to talk about that and sort of have that out in the open to be able to say like what each sibling needs in that process. I was very protective of my sister and still am. And I think that was, my mother was more protective of my sister than she was of me in some respects. So that's sort of the part of the family structure. That said, my sister's a pretty strong person who's been through a lot of stuff. Part of the deal with this was that when my mom was in a car accident, lost the use of her car. So then she went to stay with my sister while we cleaned out the house and figured out what to do next. And the house was really her only asset. So my sister had the harder job, I think, is that she had my mom at her house while we were going through this. And I was like, you know, for her to like have to come to the hoarding house and then go back and see my mom and deal with my mom, I was really worried about that because I was pretty traumatized and my sister was also pretty traumatized from the experience. And, you know, so I think, you know, I was trying to sort of like, she had the harder job in a way because she was doing that piece. So it's fine if I end up doing a little more of the clean out in some ways. But, you know, my sister did stuff like that I could not have done at the end of this. Like we moved my mom into assisted living, she made my mom a beautiful room. And at that point, I wanted to throw my mom's stuff in the room, slam the door and say, bye, I'll see you in 6 weeks. Like, just like, I'm like done with you for now. And my sister did this incredibly loving, like set up the room, made it really pretty, and like, you know, we, you know, salvaged stuff from the house and we made her this nice space. And my mother was totally not appreciative of about it. And I felt bad for my sister because it was really a gift that my sister was able to do that. I could not have done that. So when we talk about sort of different strengths, I also think my sister and I have an unusual relationship because we're technically half siblings, but we grew up together. She's always been my sister. I never thought of her as a half sibling, but her father was my stepfather. And, you know, so it's been complicated because in the book I talk about how I actually reconnected with other siblings on both our sides. She has some half siblings biologically. I have a half biological sibling. And so I don't think we ever thought of ourselves, you know, in that way, but, you know, by discovering and sort of opening up these family secrets and losses, you know, we've had to look at our relationship quite a bit. And, you know, and I think it's been good for us. You know, I think I don't write about this in the book. Actually, I do write about this in the book, but you know, we did a therapy session together with her therapist at one point and, you know, talked about some of this family dynamic and how the way my mom related to me affected how my sister and I related to each other and like what the effects of that were. And I don't think she fully got it until we sat there and really talked about it. You know, this stuff is hard to talk about in families. I mean, it's not even conscious until there's a crisis a lot of times.
Truly.
I was really curious.
I'm sorry, Dan.
I was really curious about the family therapy thing or therapy just in general. Was that the first time that you had therapy, Deb? And what precipitated that?
Well, I think, you know, it's interesting because when we were kids, we had a very complicated childhood, as I write about in the book. And my mom took us to therapy. And my sister and I talked about this after we got into the hoarding house, because my sister was like, don't you remember we used to go to therapy and like the therapist would see us because, you know, we were the problem. And then after like a session or two, the therapist wouldn't see us anymore. And we'd sit in the waiting room and the therapist would see mom. Like, you know, and I'm like, oh, yeah, I do remember that. My mom was pretty open to the help piece of it, and I write about this in the book. So I had a number of therapy experiences, some of which she facilitated, some of which I found on my own. The family therapy that we did after I blew up some secrets in the family was different. And it was my mom, my sister, and myself. And that really changed a lot of the family dynamic when we did that. Um, but you know, interestingly, as much as my mom hated that and didn't want to do it, she did it. And I think that says something about her, you know, that a lot of times, you know, she knew that there was something that wasn't right and she kind of pushed through and did it anyway.
You talk a lot about your relationship with this therapist, Sandy, and I have to say, when you first introduced Sandy in the book, I was holding my breath to find out what kind of therapist Sandy was. And as you talk more about your relationship and that course of therapy, there was one quote you shared, well, it exchanged between you and Sandy that almost brought tears to my eyes. You asked what will happen when the chasm opens up again. And you said that Sandy said, you will go down and look, but it won't be like the first time. And we'll look together. And like I was, you know, tearing up now thinking about the healing that happens over the course of a good therapeutic relationship.
Mhm.
what did you find most helpful or meaningful, impactful in some of these various therapeutic relationships that you are talking about now?
Well, I think really with Sandy, and I write about this in the book, Sandy saw my mother a couple times before she saw me. And then I went in and saw her, and I was really not, I was pretty resistant. I was in college at the time, and I was just like, this is just like whatever, like I'm not doing this. And as part, I write about this in the book, and as part of my initial session with her, she looked at me and she's like, if you come to see me, I will not see your mother anymore. And years later, in talking to her about this, we had a funny conversation about it. She's like, your mom was crazy. Like, like now once I was a therapist and we could have a conversation like that because I, have, stayed in touch with her. And, she's like, were so angry, but you had the ability to sort of, figure things out. And I wanted to work with you. And I think her choosing me and listening to me were two of the most healing things because one of the things, in my family was part of my mom's mental illness was her paranoia. And it's complicated because my mom's diagnosis is probably very complicated and complex in a lot of ways. But one of the hallmarks of it is that she was very paranoid and she could be very paranoid about me as well as other people. And I think, that makes you kind of not trust the ground you walk on. And I think one of the things I got from Sandy was somebody who grounded me. And I think good therapy does that. When I'm present with my clients and I'm listening and, hearing where they are, and that doesn't mean, of course, always agreeing with them, which we forget sometimes, in therapy, right? But I think just being present and having somebody witness your experiences is incredibly powerful. And I don't think we give it enough credence in our training. And, when we sit with people, that alone is often a very healing thing.
Yes, certainly a good therapist doesn't always have all the answers and can't always fix everything. But as you say, bearing witness and providing some grounding, can be such powerful healing factors themselves.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and I think having a trusting connection, because I think one of the things, being able to feel the feelings, I think one of the powerful things in therapy has been, if a client gets angry at me, can I tolerate that anger? Can I sit with that anger and help the person process it and stay connected while doing that? Because a lot of people have experiences of rupture when they have intense feelings like anger or sadness. So I think Sandy was one of those people who was able to stay present through intense feelings. And that allowed me to tolerate it and take it forward, and I hope that that's something that I give my clients, when I see them.
So, what I was curious about, you write very eloquently. Love your writing style.
Thank you.
It, it, you know, I really was brought into the moment with you at all times. But it made me wonder because I heard how you described your family situation, things that happened as you grew up and as you separated from your mother, and then the hoarding as it was interweaved in. But it made me wonder what would have happened had your mother written a book about you 25 years ago. What would she have said? Because you've just left, right?
Mm.
I won't. I would almost use the word stomped out, but that's probably a little over dramatic. You left,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
What would she say? Because typically we think I'm okay. You may or may not be okay, right? But
Mhm.
what would your mother have said about you?
Well, I think the paranoid pathology makes that complicated, right? Because what my mother was cued into was me being angry. And I think for me, being angry was a way to have energy to enforce the, kind of the limits with her and sort of like what was okay and what wasn't. I mean, there's one incident I write about in the book when I was in my 20s where she, unbeknownst to me, made a key to my apartment and used that key without my permission. And I was livid. And in fact, it's an interesting metaphor, right? For me going into the house later on. I mean, she gave me the key to the house, but essentially I also invaded her house later on. So there's things in the book that, you know, paint a picture about like what that relationship was like. I am certainly not blameless in that relationship. There were many times that I was angry and lost patience with her. There were times where I probably didn't understand well enough her loneliness and stuff. But also, people are responsible for their own lives, and children can't fix their parents' lives. And I think I have sadness about that in some ways because I think my mother was an incredibly smart woman and had a lot of talents, and she had a good life in a lot of ways. I mean, she was close. She was a great, a fabulous grandmother. My nieces and nephew love her. She got to meet her great grandchild right before she died in 2023. And I think, um, in the end, she had 7 good years in assisted living post hoarding. And she used to, she jokingly, haha, called it her prison, how we had put her in prison in assisted living, which was somewhat true, probably. But also, like, never told us about any of her social stuff there. And after she died, like, all these people were coming in. And like, my mom had a full life at assisted living. She had friends, she had things she did there. Like, she had a much better life than she would have had, if she had died in that, living through that hoarding house, which she would have. Thank God all that happened before COVID, because I don't know what we would have done if, there had been lockdown and she had been in that hoarding house. But, I think, if my mom was going to write the book, I probably would not, you know, she saw me as a talented person, but I think she was also somewhat threatened by me because of the paranoid stuff, and actually said that at one point. But my mom also said to me at one point, that she said, you and your sister are the best things that I ever did. She was the proudest of us, while also sometimes not knowing what to do with either relationship, I think, you know.
Dan had opened our conversation today by reflecting on just this wide-ranging picture you paint of your mother. So often books about mental illness, or the way we understand people with mental illness, is boiled down to the mental illness. And I've got to tell you, I really appreciated opening the book, and you start with a scene that's really highlighting her strengths, her curiosity, her intellect. And you just reflected a short while ago about that's a large part of what allowed you to get in there and do the things you had to do. Is that
Mhm.
relationship was rooted in love, and that there was love there. Um,
Yeah, there was a kind of magicalness about, so the paranoia, right? In a sense, there's a kind of porousness with the world that comes from, everything being interconnected and having meaning, right? And hoarding's like that too, right? Every object has meaning, everything has a memory attached to it. My mom was a frustrated writer and artist. She wasn't, her parents didn't really encourage that piece of her life. And I think for her, she was a wonderful teacher in the sense that, she was curious about things and things were magical. We had the birthday, we were the only people on earth who had the birthday fairy who showed up on our birthdays and left our presents, and my mom had this whole like thing that she would set up on the dining room table and the presents would be there and stuff. And even things like the teaching stuff, like when I was like 7 or 8, we spent a summer learning about, she was very interested in other religions and stuff. And so we had a summer where we learned about all different ways that other people worship. I learned about Muslims and Jews and how Catholics worship. We grew up Protestant, but how do Buddhists worship? And like we went to different churches and temples and we visited and we sat through a service. And, and that upbringing is like no kids get raised like that that I know of, or very few. Maybe if you go to the Unitarian church, you do, but like it taught us tolerance, right? We had a sort of understanding about the world that was different, and her ideas were like, you learn a lot of different things and, people are interesting and, you know, so I was always surprised, like when I grew up and people didn't know about other people's cultures or religions because we had grown up, like she was curious about that stuff. So you should learn that stuff too. You worship this way, but other people worship other ways, and that's valid too. I think it's made me a better psychologist. It certainly made me a good writer. She was always good for the creativity piece, and ironically, right? the thing about the creativity piece, I mean, I started out my writing career writing poetry, which I think was a way of sort of having a coded voice that wasn't so direct. I write nonfiction now. You can't get much more direct than that. You know, through the years, I've sort of morphed into doing that as well, poetically. Um, but I think that when I started writing and keeping a journal, I've been, keeping a journal since I was 17, seriously. I started trying to write when I was probably 9. But part of that was also about having a voice that I listened to because I didn't feel heard in my family.
I'll stick with this theme of curiosity, take it in a somewhat different direction. There's this part of the book where I think you're getting ready to embark in adulthood and not quite sure where your future is going to take you. And you talk about it's time to go on a nana ride. Your grandfather, and you talk about how, he would kind of go out into the world and get lost sometimes. And was thinking about the metaphor, and it so often applies to therapy, and we can apply it to so many life situations where when the future is uncertain, when the next step is uncertain, we can be overwhelmed with anxiety and dread, or we can try to be open and curious.
Mhm.
And I recognize that some of the more severe situations you describe in the book, like going to clean out your mother's house, maybe this won't quite work there. But there's so many of these situations in your life that you reflect in, and the lives that we all live, where there's the value that you speak to in approaching life with curiosity. And I think I'm going to hang on to that sentence about a Nanu ride as a metaphor for that.
Yeah. Yeah, my grandfather was a funny guy. He had a really good sense of humor, and he often would get lost. And his thing was, you're going to get there eventually, and you may as well enjoy this like beautiful countryside and where you're going. And it was a metaphor in my family. We like to take nano rides and sort of do that. I do think though the hoarding house is a little bit like that, right? Because one of the ironic things was a version of this book was done in 2014. I had made a conscious decision not to write about my mom until she was gone. And so I had written a book about becoming a writer and growing up and being a psychologist and some other stuff about my family. And I had shopped it around with literary agents. I had a literary agent as a result of the New York Times publications. And everybody who saw the draft of it said, the writing is wonderful. You're, an excellent writer, but there's something missing from the story. Well, what was missing from the story, obviously, was my mother. And then after the hoarding happened, ironically, the hoarding organized the book. The hoarding story organized the book because even though it was my mother's story and it was complicated to tell it, it wasn't totally my mother's story. It was my story, and it was our family's story. And I felt I had the right to tell it. And my sister, I talked to my sister about it, and my sister's like, you tell your story. You can tell your story. I'm okay with that. Um, and it wasn't a cathartic telling. I want to make that clear because I think people sometimes have the idea that memoir is cathartic. I think it may be cathartic to read. There's certainly a lot of feeling in it, but it's a shaped piece of art. And one of the things that shapes it is how that holding on to the original title for the book was What We Hold On To. Didn't work for various reasons, but how that hoarding and holding on you know, and sort of keeping the connections is so important, and that having compassion around that is really, what keeps things afloat. But ironically, the mental illness kind of organized the book in that sense. The hoarding house did.
So, in many respects, we're shaped, and some of our personality traits are embedded because of how we were brought up, because of our mothers, because of our fathers, whatever the case may be. You certainly had maybe a few more complexities, mental health complexities as a child than others. But how does that how does that translate now to your relationship with your husband or
Mhm.
with others? Do you find that there's an edge? Do you find that there's more perceptiveness in a certain way? What do you see?
Well, I think, look, all of our experiences shape us and give us insight into other people. It's like Erica, what you were talking about. It's like your experiences are different because of, TBI is different than mental illness, but there are commonalities to being a daughter in that role, to being a caregiver in that role, right? I think one of the things that we don't talk enough about is, we sort of pay lip service to resilience. And I think what we don't talk about enough is sort of what is involved in resilience. Because sometimes anger is involved in resilience. Sometimes, humor for sure. There's humor in my book. Um, like, how do you, I mean, I think, my husband and I joke that our love language is humor. Like, I think, people who've survived things, have a deeper, I feel like, appreciation for how tenuous things can be in some ways. We work with, a lot of times our clients come to us with what I fondly call Job years, where there's like 85 terrible things that happen in one year. And people are just overwhelmed and they're like, how am I ever going to get through this? And it's like, suffering isn't distributed, evenly. It's distributed randomly, and everybody has suffering in their lives and times where they're overwhelmed. And I think first of all, we don't normalize that. Somehow you're just supposed to cope with that and it's going to be okay. And one of the things I feel like this book does is sort of normalize, like, even when you're a mental health professional, you still suffer, you still struggle, you still do these things. But the other piece that I hope comes across is that there is a kind of resilience to that. There's a resilience to people's relationships. I'm not a fan of cutoffs. I'm not a fan of, our field, I think, is way too quick these days to talk about boundary setting and cutoffs. And I think that is not adaptive. You don't get to divorce your family. Even if you're not dealing with them directly, you're still dealing with them in your head. So it's much better to try and work out what you can work out. I'm not saying there aren't times where distance and vacations are appropriate, but like, I think we're far too quick to sort of, trash relationships that may be complicated. And I think one of the things about resilience is that people have a lot of resilience. We don't give ourselves enough credit for that. I mean, our clients have tremendous resilience, even when they're suffering a lot of times. And I think that being able to look at that is really important. And that was important for me in the book, was to sort of, I'm certainly no poster child for it, but I think, you know, you can grow. And I think that's the piece that I wanted to show, you know.
Your experience and story is certainly unique, but one of the pieces of it that is far more common, if not universal, is the part of the life cycle where the child, the adult child, becomes more like the parent, whether that's regular aging, whether that's a parent that goes on to develop dementia, or just needs assistance as they get older. There's that stage of the relationship where the scale shifts essentially. So even though your experiences were unique compared to many others, I'm wondering if you have any insights or reflections to share about that part of life.
Yeah, I think a couple things. My biological father died in 2018 on hospice, and my brother and I were with him, and so I've sort of been through that piece of it. His wife, my stepmother, actually has pretty advanced dementia now, so she's in memory care, and we're sort of getting into that phase of like trying to decide how to best handle, palliative care and stuff. Um, my mom died rather suddenly, and it was not a good death. There were a lot of, it was sudden, and the hospital didn't manage it well, and it was really not a good scene. I think, when we talk about end of life care, I think one of the things that we don't talk enough about is sort of anticipatory grief as a parent ages. Also, some of, which going through dementia, going through illness, going through cancer, whatever the different things are, that there's a lot of anticipatory grief. I think it's more complicated when there's a complicated relationship with the parent, that, you know, the grief isn't just about the loss. The grief is about the loss of possibility that things can be different. So part of the thing that, I think doesn't get talked about enough is like when my mom died, there was grief, normal grief. She was 80, how old was she? I just forget now. She had just turned 89 when she died. You know, like, you know, there's normal grief about that, but also there's the grief that, you know, no matter what I did or didn't do, right, that relationship is going to be that relationship. And there were some very tough things about my relationship with my mom, and that can never be fixed. So I think part of that grief that doesn't get acknowledged enough, maybe, is that it's the loss of hope. You know, that relationship is just going to be what that relationship is. And, um, you know, so I think in addition to the changed roles, which sometimes, you know, like, you know, the caregiving thing can also be rewarding and can feel good. You get to give back to a parent who gave to you. I think it gets complicated when the parent didn't always give to you and expects care. And so there's a lot of complex feelings that come up around that, you know, but I think it is an opportunity to heal some of that too in the change dynamics. So it depends on the people involved. And I think that it depends somewhat on the openness of the people involved to be able to shift roles and to be able to talk about it even a little bit. Like my family was not a talk, like, let's talk about this stuff kind of thing. But there are ways that we talk without talking, right? Like my mom might allow me to do something. There might not be a whole conversation about it. But you know, she left that house. She never looked back. She knew, and she let us take care of it, you know, even though it was never fully acknowledged what that meant.
I think similarly as the adult children who are caregivers, it's not unusual for us to also find ways to still let our parents be parents and care for us, or be in
Mhm.
that seat. So I think that, you know, often we experience that give and take.
Yeah, I was reading something recently. Somebody was working with folks who have dementia. And my stepmother is not verbal, so she can't really do this. But they were saying, you know, one of the things that they were doing is like the parent could still talk about, you know, work and sort of listen, and so they would ask advice, you know, and that it felt good to be able to have the parent who was having the dementia issues be able to offer something, you know. And I think we forget, like, people are still people, even if they're, you know, declining, and we're all going to be there at some point.
So at the end of the day, are you resentful of your mother?
No, I really feel like, you know, one of the things that was good about going through this process, um, you know, was that it was freeing in a way. Like going into that house, like I've known since I was very small that my mother was an unusual person and had some issues. Um, and, you know, she functioned at a very high level. So other people didn't always see that. So I was sort of stuck dealing with that a lot of times, and sort of it wasn't acknowledged or recognized, even in my own family. My sister didn't even see some of it. I think we've talked about this since. And I think, you know, one of the interesting things about the hoarding house was that, you know, this is what was always there. The inside mess, you know, was always part of my mother. And that in a way, it sort of freed me up from the shame of having to protect her or protect myself from the realities of that relationship. And I think when you let yourself be free of that and you're not carrying shame that's not yours, the hoarding house was not my shame. My family felt that shame. You know, when I talk in the book about, you know, like, well, why didn't you do something sooner about the house? People ask, right? And I was like, well, she was an autonomous person. What was I going to do? Throw her, you know, tell her to get out of her own house? Like, you know, plus she could be a little scary when she got angry, to be frank. But, you know, she's a tiny woman, but she could be big when she was angry, you know. So I think, you know, I don't think that there's resentment. I mean, I feel actually, I felt a lot of freedom once the house was cleaned out and she was settled. I was kind of like, you know what, like, I don't, you know, I don't have to carry this. This is not my responsibility. I will help care for her. You know, I love her as my mother. I will do what I need to do, but I don't feel that. Trust me, I felt plenty of rage during the process. But, you know, the opposite of love is not, you know, anger and hatred, it's indifference. And I was never indifferent to her. So,
I was also struck, and there's a quote in your book. And let me just read that, and then
mhm,
let's talk about it just for a second. Um, a a person, I believe it's at the life care place, says if you just met your mother superficially, she wouldn't qualify. That was for Medicaid, I believe. But I spent 2 hours with her. She's delightful. I really enjoyed meeting her. She told me all about her grandchildren, the art in her room, her travels. She also read all of your materials. It doesn't seem like it could be the same person because
Yeah.
you'd prepped this person. And you find these people around in your lives that where there's clearly something wrong that one person sees, but no one else does. Did your sisters know that your mother was different, if you will, like you did? Or was it something that you knew, and did it make you angry that you had to protect the world from this, that you weren't able to really talk about it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like, yeah, I think my sister knew, but my sister's relationship with her was different. My mother was different with my sister. And so I think there were other pieces of that that maybe were problematic for my sister. And I won't speak for her, but I do think you know, I was protective when I put her in the assisted living because we didn't talk about the extent of the hoarding. And there's actually a hilarious scene in there where we're trying to get her into assisted living, and they're like, "Oh, we've had hoarders here before. Like they steal all the sugar packets." And I'm like, "Well, you're gonna have housekeeping going in there every week." Like, it's a little more than the sugar packet stealing. But I basically wrote a psych report to get her Medicaid, including pictures of the house, because I had deliberately not told the assisted living the extent of things. And the nurse who you're quoting in there, um, she got it, she understood. But I think that that's always been the thing, right? Is like there's this dichotomy between, sort of, we used to joke, we used to call her mom white and mom black, but like there is kind of that. I mean, it's not fully dissociative, but there was a little bit of that quality to it of like, you never knew quite who you were going to be dealing with, you know? So, yeah, it felt like different people when you looked at that house. Like, how could she live like that? There is a thing called, we haven't talked much about the hoarding thing, and I'll do my 2 second spiel, but one of the things about hoarding is that there's a thing called clutter blindness, which is a kind of dissociation where people don't see the mess that they're in. They don't smell it, they don't see it, they don't perceive it the same way as somebody else sees it. And when I tell you the number of people that are affected by this, for example, in the Reddit groups that I sort of, I did some reading and research after this was all over to find out how I didn't handle it the way all the psychologists recommend that you handle it. And I was poking around in some of the Reddit groups. There's a 60,000 plus group of hoarders, the hoarder group on Reddit. And then there's like about 28,000 people in the two, at least there's probably more, but the two children of hoarder groups that I had sort of been checking into and talking to people in there. And some of that hoarding started, people grew up in houses like my mom was living in. So, and I think you know, it's secret. Like people don't talk about this. As I've been going out and doing talks and stuff, I would say in every audience, not just like sort of like I went through my parents' clean out and they had a lot of stuff, and people identify with the book because of that and this process of grieving and sort of dealing with a parent who's difficult. But like true folks who are in the middle of hoarding stuff, I can't tell you how many people have come up to me afterwards and said, we're dealing with this and we don't really know what to do with it. And as a field, I think psychology, has not done a good job in figuring out how to treat it. And it's related to anxiety, it's related to depression, it's triggered a lot by trauma and grief. We don't really understand it. It's probably related more to addictive disorders. Originally, it was thought to relate more to OCD and obsessive compulsive kinds of disorders. There's some quality to that, I think, for some people. But it's a very complicated diagnosis that has a lot of different things involved with it. And the people who are doing the hoarding behavior themselves frequently don't ask for help. It's the families that are, struggling with it. I will say, and I don't know what's going to happen ultimately with this, but one of the treatments that has been more effective is group treatment Because one of the things about hoarding is about loneliness and about isolation, and that putting people who do the hoarding behavior together and having them help each other kind of get through it with some facilitation has actually proved sort of effective. And in fact, even Medicare was looking at, I don't know what's going to happen with any of this now, but Medicare was even looking at sort of funding some programming around that, to try and, because that was actually proving to be more effective than sending somebody in to try and like unpack the drawer. And, when you're in the middle of a DEFCON 5 hoarding situation, sorting out somebody's drawers really not going to cut it. So yeah, we as a field, we really, we struggle in terms of how do we treat this and how do we help people with it.
Is there something you know now that you wish you could have shared with in the past?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I do know now that there are actual companies that go in hazmat suits and do the clean out. We didn't have the money or the resources to do that at the time. And I don't think I could have done that because of the way her hoarding was. We had to go in and salvage particular things, and it was meaningful to do that. But I mean, there are some of these support groups for, people who are going through it. I think one of the things that was important to me was not to sensationalize the hoarding behavior, but to tell it accurately. And I really hope I did that. I mean, because I think, the shows like Hoarders and stuff like that really sensationalize it, and it just increases the amount of shame people feel about it. And it's not that somebody doing this behavior is lazy or whatever. They have a mental illness, like they're struggling. So I think as a culture to sort of exploit that is like not okay. So it was very important to me in this book to be respectful about it. We wouldn't sensationalize depression or, bipolar disorder. Why are we doing that with a hoarding disorder?
So I wanted to ask you both. Well, actually, Erica, first I wanted to ask you, you mentioned, I believe it was your father's mental illness. But I've known you for a little while. I didn't know that till more just recently. Is that a secret, much like Deb was talking about? Is that something that you carry with you that never gets discussed with others, or not appropriate to discuss? Are there issues associated with that as well?
It's not a secret. And in fact, one of the many loving things and supportive things my dad has done in my lifetime was at some point say to me that if I felt like I needed his permission to share his experiences, my experiences with him, with others, personally or professionally, that I was welcome to do that. One of the things that Deb talked about today that is relevant in this way to me, and it's relevant to many of my clients and to others who have family members, whether they're parents or spouses or others who have a mental illness or an addiction, is how much of that story belongs to the person with the mental illness or addiction, and thus you want to protect their privacy around that and their ability to control that narrative. And when does their story become your story? When, does my dad's story become my story? When did Deb's mom's story become her story? And then it is ours to share, because we deserve to be able to talk freely about our experiences, to seek support from people who we need to seek support from. So I think that is probably a very common issue, maybe even a conundrum for many people who love someone with a mental illness or with an addiction.
And I think in the book, one of the things that becomes clear, right, is that, her story was my story all along. Our parents' stories shape us and they make us who we are in a lot of ways, whoever raises us or significant others and all of that. So, yeah. I mean, I think there are things that are kept private, and I did keep things private in the book that I certainly could have talked about, that were my mother's to tell or not tell. But also, I think, Erica, to your point, like it's really important to be able to speak it. I think like in our culture, you know, the issue of shame comes up a lot around these issues, and I think it's not it stops us from growing in a lot of ways. If you're caught in that shame, you don't grow in the same way.
So, when you think about what we've covered over the course of our time together here, there's a lot of things that may resonate with anyone in any one individual. So if somebody found a need to like, oh, that's me, they want to talk, who do they talk to? Do they talk to their significant other? Do they talk to their friends? Do they talk to their minister, rabbi, whatever other of that ilk there are? Do they talk to therapists? Who do they talk? Do they go on the internet? What do you do?
Well, there are resources. You can go to my website, actually, lostfoundkept.com. I have some resources on that website. Definitely therapist. If you're a child of a hoarder, a child whose parent is mentally ill, it is super helpful to have a, mental health professional. I'll be biased and say a psychologist since I am one. But I think it's super helpful to have a good therapist, a good psychologist to talk to, because I think having that support for yourself is important. Certainly all of the above, you know. Also, the internet, I will say that not all of the Reddit groups are helpful, but the Children of Hoarder, there's a Child of Hoarder Reddit group and a Children of Hoarders Reddit group. The Child of Hoarder Reddit group is actually quite good. There's resources on there. There's people, the community is extremely supportive. And, it's painful to read stuff in there, but it's also been delightful to see the amount of support that people get and validation that they get for their situations. And, so I think that, it can be helpful. You have to pick and choose appropriately. Unfortunately, we don't have Children of Hoarders support groups, but I'll bet if somebody started one, there'd be a line to get in. So it's something you guys can think about doing. Like honestly, like there's not many places. A lot of towns and cities have commissions on hoarding and on dealing with hoarding in the community because it can be so toxic. It can be very difficult, to deal with if you're a neighbor of somebody who's hoarding, for example. So, but all of the above, Dan, I think would be accurate.
So I'd like to give each of you, 30 seconds to kind of close, summarize, or I know with your book, pitch your book. But Erica, I'll let you go first. How would you summarize, or what do you need? What do you feel the need to say?
One of the issues we talked a little bit about today, and maybe could have talked about a little bit more, is as an adult child moving into the role of a caregiver, whether that's with someone with a severe mental illness, as we said, with dementia, or simply the aging process, the issue of autonomy comes up a lot. And I really appreciate Deb speaking to that today. And she even gave a fairly concrete line. I think that was very helpful that she said she talked about in her ethics class, because I think that can be one of the most difficult issues to sort through. And, you'll see some adult children caregiving who kind of want to take control and, take control of everything. You'll see other people who kind of want to step back and avoid. But a lot of us walk in the gray. And that may be a dance, right? It may not be. Today we're living in a space where I'm going to give my parent all the autonomy we want. Oh no, we've crossed that line, and now I need to take control. And there may be an extended period of time where it is a dance between where can my parents still be autonomous, and where do I need to step in and provide more directed care and help. For most people, as time goes by, you're going to start to spend more time in the camp of more directed care and help. In sharing this reflection, I can't say I have the answer. I can't say, like, here's when you do autonomy and here's when you do directed care and help. But I just want to share the resonance and that experience that I think is common to so many of us who step into a caregiving role with a family member.
Yeah. And I think it's a universal experience, Erica. I think it's so common. And I think, and that struggle in our culture that values autonomy and independence makes it even more difficult because to ask for help as you age is a hard thing to do because it feels like giving up or it feels like not being strong or doing a lot of things like that. So I think it's even more complicated for the older adult as well. So I think I think you capture it very well. And I think definitely support for that is really important.
Yeah. And I
So,
guess I'll add to that, while I recognize that we live in a culture that does value autonomy, and I'm glad for that for many reasons, that same culture can sometimes easily slip into the notion that there is a fix for everything. How to fix this, right?
Uh-huh.
And that's a really hard piece of this role of being a caregiver, is others' outside expectations that go talk some sense into your mother and fix this.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So
so Deb,
I'll just say my 2 minute piece, go to
please.
lostfoundkept.com and there's some other stories. There's links to different publications, different resources. You can find out more about the book. There are links to order the book. You can order the book direct from Trio House Press or your favorite independent bookstore. More Books in Havertown has it. Also, the big retailers who we won't mention, but we'll say Amazon, bookshop.org, other places you can order through there as well. I'm going to have an audio book, but probably not for about 6 to 8 months. There is an ebook, though, that you can order. And I also just want to say that if anybody's interested in the book and has a book group and wants me to come talk either by Zoom or in person, I'm happy to do that. And, anybody else, feel free to reach out through the website. I'm happy to talk. I'm not taking new clients though. So for the client stuff, they have to call you guys.
Well, great. Thank you very much. And I'm glad that you guys could both come on today. I wanted to say, to your point, Erica, we actually have done several podcasts about caregiving, and we have some more that we will be doing from different perspectives because it's both fraught with disaster, emotion, and love. Going through that caregiving. So we have dealt with it, and we will continue to deal with it. But I did want to say, actually, by the way, I would also tell you, Deb, that Equilibria is buying a couple of the books for their offices. So
Oh, thank
just
you.
just
Thank
to
you. I
let you.
appreciate that.
So our sponsor today is Equilibria Psychological and Consultation Services, 7 offices in the Philadelphia area. Their mission is to help individuals achieve their personal potential and long-term growth. Visit equilibriapcs.com, equilibriapcs.com. Look for them on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You can also find me on Instagram, Daniel J. Gomez 24, and on LinkedIn. Now, for the quick disclaimer, I am not a medical professional, nor am I providing medical advice. The opinion of our speakers are solely theirs alone. This podcast is copyrighted and cannot be reproduced without the express written consent of EPCS Management, LLC.